When I asked my wife what sort of video I should do, she said she liked the ones that contained information about history. And I said, well, that's great, but where should I start? At which point she went all Mad Hatter on me and basically said, start at the beginning. And when you get to the end, stop. If we're going to start at the beginning, we have to go all the way back to France, 1769, with the Cutnut. Cutnut? Actually, I'm not even sure how to say it. It's generally considered the first automobile, even though it wasn't really an automobile as we think of it today. It had a giant steam engine connected directly to the single front wheel. It was a very large vehicle that seated one person and whose sole purpose was essentially to move cannons. It wasn't a super successful vehicle. I think 2 of them were made and the first one crashed. This led to a series of steam-powered vehicles with varying degrees of success. Mostly larger vehicles, tractor-like vehicles, some buses, that sort of thing. The problem with these early steam-powered vehicles is the steam engines themselves required a lot of attention, focus from the driver away from actually driving. And they didn't take being shaken up so well. A combination of lack of suspension and unpaved roads meant that boiler explosions were not necessarily a rare thing. So it's not surprising that 30 years after this first steam-powered vehicle, they started putting them on tracks. So really this was the predecessor to the train more so than the automobile. And even steam-powered cars like the Stanley Steamer were more of an evolutionary side shoot than a direct descendant. If we're looking at the beginning of modern automobiles as we see them, we'd be going more than a century later to 1885, 1886 Germany, where we have 2 competing people trying to develop or perfect the internal combustion engine, Gottlieb Daimler and Carl Benz. Carl Benz gave us the 3-wheeled patent motor wagon, and Gottlieb Daimler gave us the Daimler riding car, which was actually a motorcycle. So in 1886, you effectively got the first car out of Germany and the first motorcycle out of Germany. Some people like to debate over which one should get credit for being first, but it's kind of a moot point because really the 2 companies would merge to form Daimler-Benz, which in America we know probably a little better as Mercedes. And there's a whole story behind how that happened, but I won't get into that at this point. The first American car is kind of up for debate. A lot of companies were copying Benzes, and one of the companies that copied Benz was the Black in America. And there's some suggestion that they were doing that as early as 1893. But the car that's actually given credit for being the first American car was the Duria, which came out in 1894. And it was pretty successful at the beginning. It did well in endurance races, beating competition that mostly came from Europe. And it's kind of a sad story how the company kind of turned on itself and didn't survive long term. The company that showed up before the turn of the century that we might be more familiar with is Oldsmobile. Oldsmobile arrived in 1896. And it's kind of a bit of irony that for most of its existence, it was America's oldest existing car company. The name itself derives from the founder, Ransom Eli Olds. So it really had nothing to do with being old, even though a lot of people kind of thought that way. And there was several marketing campaigns over the years trying to move away from this idea that Oldsmobile was somehow related to old. They had different campaigns such as Oldsmobile is now Youngmobile, or it's not your father's Oldsmobile, and various other sort of things. After the turn of the century, car companies in America were popping up at a rate of almost 50 a year and disappearing at approximately the same rate. Most companies failed within the first couple of years of trying to get into the industry. One of the first major successes was, again, Oldsmobile, partially due to tragedy, actually. Their plant burnt down and they had to adapt to that. So a couple of things just came together to help make a company that was very successful at the time. One was that they had to contract out to suppliers to build major components, suppliers such as Dodge Brothers. And this also meant that their assembly plant was using more of a assembly line kind of assembly instead of manufacturers working together to build one single car at a time. And the car itself was also a part of its success because it was stylish for its age. The Oldsmobile Type R, better known as the curved dash Oldsmobile, was relatively affordable. It was stylish, it was durable, and they even had a decent marketing strategy going where they had two vehicles that they drove around to display how reliable the vehicle was and how durable it was, and doing demonstrations of what was at the time considered the ultimate test in performance by being able to drive upstairs. To put the Oldsmobile's success into perspective, in 1902, total U.S. sales was just over 4,000 units. In 1903, the Oldsmobile Type R, or curved dash Oldsmobile, sold approximately 4,000 units by itself, and that sales figure went up in 1904 to 5,500, and then 1905 to 6,500. So setting sales records all of those years. That success, unfortunately, led to some conflict inside the company itself, and Ransom left the company to create a new company called Rio, which ended up being where the origins of the name REO Speedwagon for the band came from. But Oldsmobile sales declined after that. So you're probably asking yourself at this point, where is Ford? Well, Ford was all over the place, actually. Ford started his first automobile company in 1899, the Detroit Automobile Company, which was less than successful and ended up being reorganized in 1901 as the Henry Ford Company. And like Oldsmobile, there was internal conflict, and Henry Ford left to create the Ford Motor Company. Meanwhile, the Henry Ford Company was taken over by Henry Leland and became Cadillac after the founder of the city of Detroit, Antoine de la Mothe Cadillac. Surprisingly to some, I suspect, Cadillac actually outsold Ford during these early years. And the reason Cadillac outsold Ford during these early years is because they had better quality. They were the first car company to win the Dewar Engineering Award, and they did this by displaying that the internal components of the engine were interchangeable between multiple cars, which wasn't unique at the time, but it was still considered a sign of high quality, something that we probably take for granted now. And that's where Cadillac established itself as the so-called standard of excellence. Meanwhile, over at Ford, Henry was creating new models every couple of months. He was still focusing on development. And that all changed with the Model T. The Model T was, to him, probably considered perfection. And from a sales perspective, it probably was as close as you were going to get. Not only did the Model T shoot to #1 in sales, but it would totally change the U.S. market and the global market for the next 20 years. Another car that we have to consider during the first decade of the 19th or the 20th century would have to be Buick. Buick was created by David Dunbar Buick, an inventor who made his fortune by creating a process that annealed porcelain to steel, which made bathtubs, essentially, a more common item in the household. And he created an engine that was an overhead valve design that was essentially very advanced for its time. And the Buick automobile was introduced in 1907, the same year as the Model T. And it caught the attention of one William Durant, who took over the company and used it as the basis for creating General Motors. So he used General Motors to try to take over a number of other successful companies. Some use the term, if you can't beat them, buy them. He took over Oldsmobile and Cadillac and Oakland and made an attempt to take over Ford that failed. He also took over a couple of commercial vehicle companies that were consolidated to become GMC Trucks and some electronic firms that became AC Delco. But he also ended up, his spending inside the company ended up with him losing control of the company. And we'll come back to that in a little bit. First, I want to go back to the Model T and its success. Kind of put in perspective how successful the Model T really was. So in 1910, Model T sales were seemingly astronomical, 32,000 units approximately. And the only company that was even close at the time was Buick at about 30,000 units. So these two companies were essentially dominating the U.S. market at the time. I mean, there were several other ones that were successful and selling well and making money, but these two were at the top of the segment. In 1910, 32,000 sales seemed like a lot, but really it was just a drop in the bucket of what was to come for the Model T. By the end of the next decade, Ford had exceeded over 800,000 in sales, when its closest competitors were still under 200,000 in sales. And in its peak in the early 30s, it hit 1.8 million, and that's in the U.S. By this point, Model Ts were being built in 18 different countries. Actually, half of the cars in the entire world were Ford Model Ts, so something that probably will never be said again. Part of Ford's downfall actually came at the hands of William Durant and Chevrolet. Durant used Chevrolet as a means to try to get control back over General Motors, and the car itself was aimed specifically to compete with Ford. And even though it started out as independent, it did become part of Chevrolet or General Motors quite quickly. And with the backing of the bigger company, was able to offer a more modern vehicle for about the same amount of money. This didn't happen overnight. Chevrolet took a while to build up in popularity and down in price to actually be competitive with Ford. The teens itself for the auto industry was kind of significant. You had the First World War to contend with, which impacted automotive sales more in Europe than in the U.S., but there was a slight decline, which Ford actually took the biggest hit of, which is natural because it was the biggest seller. What you also had was Henry Leland break off of Cadillac to start adapting Cadillac engines for aircraft use, which was great during the war, but after the war he wanted to get back into the auto industry, and so that company became Lincoln. Without being under the control of General Motors, though, Leland was trying to build essentially the perfect car, a car that would last forever. And cost was no concern. So not surprisingly, people couldn't afford the car, and he ended up filing for bankruptcy. And Henry Ford ended up coming in and taking over the company. So I guess it kind of went full circle there as far as the luxury aspect of the Henry Ford Company and Cadillac and becoming Lincoln and going back to Ford. Cadillac, in the meantime, was winning the Dewar Award again, this time for introducing the modern electrical system, which included battery, starter, lights, and generator. During this time, we also had Dodge Brothers move away from being a supplier to becoming a manufacturer. Their focus was on durability. They weren't necessarily great marketing people. Their social skills were considered a little bit lacking, particularly among professionals. But the car itself ended up being a huge success. I think I might actually create another video that just goes over the sales and what was popular during these periods. But I think at this point, I'm going to wrap this video up. It's getting a little longish. I know we have a long way to go, but I think this was a pretty good start. Let me know how you feel and what you think I forgot.